There is a lesson Janet Lee Bouvier reportedly repeated to her two eldest daughters over tea, again and again, throughout their entire childhood. The secret to a happy life, she told them plainly, was money and power. It was advice neither daughter ever forgot, and it shaped one of them into arguably the most famous woman of the entire 20th century, even as Janet herself buried one of her own four children and watched her first marriage collapse into public humiliation, all while the world stayed fixated on the glamorous first lady she had raised. An ambitious young woman from a self-made family. Janet Norton Lee was born on December 3, 1907, in Manhattan, the middle daughter of James Thomas Lee, a successful lawyer and real estate developer, and Margaret Merritt. Both of her parents came from Irish Catholic families, though Janet herself would later make somewhat inconsistent claims about her ancestry over the years, at times suggesting a connection to the prominent Lee family of Maryland and Virginia, a claim that had little basis in documented fact, but that reflected the kind of social positioning that would come to define much of her adult life. Her father had built genuine wealth through his own hard work in real estate development, developing several notable apartment buildings across Manhattan and giving Janet a comfortable, well-educated upbringing that included studies at both Sweetbriar College and Barnard College, along with earlier schooling at the exclusive Miss Spence's School in New York City, an education considered among the finest available to a young woman of her social standing during that era. From a young age, Janet displayed genuine talent as an equestrienne, eventually winning 3 national championships at the prestigious National Horse Show, an accomplishment that reflected both natural skill and the kind of disciplined, competitive drive that would characterize much of her personality throughout her life. It was a passion she would go on to instill directly in her eldest daughter, putting young Jacqueline on a horse for the very first time when the girl was barely a year old, setting in motion a lifelong love of riding that Jackie would carry with her for the rest of her days, eventually winning several national championships of her own by the time she was just 11 years old, a detail that the New York Times itself covered with genuine admiration at the time, describing the young rider's poise and skill in terms that already hinted at the composed, elegant public figure she would eventually become decades later. In 1928, Janet married John Vernou Bouvier III, a wealthy Wall Street stockbroker known to nearly everyone by his nickname, Blackjack, a dashing, charismatic man whose family had emigrated from France generations earlier and had built a considerable fortune and reputation of their own within elite East Coast society over multiple generations, including relatives who had made their mark in law, business, and even, in one memorable later chapter of the extended family's history, the eccentric world later immortalized in the documentary Grey Gardens, which centered on Blackjack's own sister and niece. Their wedding brought together two prominent New York families, and on the surface, it appeared to be exactly the kind of advantageous match Janet's own mother might have hoped for her daughter. What neither Janet nor anyone else attending that wedding could have fully anticipated, however, was just how quickly and how publicly that seemingly perfect marriage would begin to unravel, setting the stage for a family story considerably more complicated than the polished, elegant image most people still associate with the Bouvier name today. A marriage undone by infidelity and drink. Janet and Blackjack Bouvier welcomed their first child, a daughter named Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, on July 28, 1929, in Southampton, New York. 4 years later, in March of 1933, their second daughter arrived, a girl named Caroline Lee Bouvier, who would be known to nearly everyone throughout her life simply as Lee. For a brief period, the young family appeared to embody exactly the kind of glamorous East Coast society life that Janet had always aspired toward, splitting their time between Manhattan and the fashionable summer community of East Hampton, Long Island, where young Jackie began riding almost as soon as she could walk, developing a bond with horses that would remain one of the defining passions of her entire life, a passion she shared closely with her mother from her very earliest years. But beneath that polished surface, serious trouble was already brewing. Blackjack Bouvier's persistent womanizing and increasingly serious struggles with alcohol placed enormous strain on the marriage almost from its earliest years, and rumors of his infidelities reportedly circulated openly within their social circle well before Janet herself finally decided she could no longer tolerate the situation, a painful reality that stood in stark contrast to the elegant, carefree image the young couple projected at the many society events they continued attending together during those difficult early years. Janet, understandably unwilling to simply tolerate her husband's repeated infidelities, separated from him in 1936, when Jackie was still only a young girl and Lee barely more than a toddler. The couple attempted a brief reconciliation the following year, in 1937. But the underlying problems proved impossible to resolve, and Janet and Blackjack finally divorced in 1940, when Jackie was 10 years old and old enough to understand, at least in part, exactly what her family was going through. A difficult milestone that arrived right around the same period Jackie was beginning to establish herself academically at Miss Chapin's school in Manhattan. The divorce marked a genuinely painful chapter for both girls, one that reshaped their relationship with their father for the remainder of his life. Though Jackie in particular adored her father and continued seeing him regularly even after the split, the distance between them grew steadily over the following years, especially once Janet's own life took a dramatic new direction that would carry the family considerably further away, both geographically and socially, from the world Blackjack still inhabited. For Janet herself, the divorce represented both genuine heartbreak and, in a sense, an opportunity to pursue exactly the kind of secure, comfortable life she had always believed her daughters deserved, a pursuit that would soon lead her toward one of the wealthiest and most well-connected men in the entire country. A second marriage that reshaped the entire family. In 1942, Janet married Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., a wealthy Wall Street stockbroker and attorney who also happened to be an heir to the considerable Standard Oil fortune built by his family generations earlier. It was Hugh's third marriage, and it brought together an even more complicated blended family than Janet's first marriage had produced, since Hugh already had 3 children of his own from his 2 previous marriages. Hugh III, known within the family as Yusha, along with Nina and Thomas, each of whom carried their own share of complicated family history from their father's earlier unions, having themselves already grown accustomed to navigating a household reshaped by divorce and remarriage well before Janet and her 2 daughters arrived. Combined with Jackie and Lee from Janet's first marriage, the newly formed Auchincloss household already included 5 children before Janet and Hugh had even had the chance to welcome any children together, making for an unusually large and complex blended family, even by the standards of wealthy East Coast society during that era, one that required careful navigation of loyalties, holidays, and household routines across multiple sets of half-siblings. The marriage brought Janet and her 2 daughters into a considerably wealthier and more socially prominent world than the one they had known during her first marriage. The family divided their time between Marywood, a grand estate in Virginia just outside Washington, D.C., and Hammersmith Farm, an even more expansive property in Newport, Rhode Island, where the family spent their summers. A property so large, it reportedly included its own working farm alongside the main residence, along with sweeping views of Narragansett Bay that made it one of the most admired estates anywhere along the New England coastline. It was an extraordinary upgrade in both wealth and social standing, and Jackie and Lee grew up moving between these 2 impressive properties, receiving the kind of elite education and social exposure that would shape both of their futures considerably, including tutoring, riding lessons, and access to the kind of social circles that would eventually help position Jackie for her own extraordinary future. Circles that included some of the most prominent families in both Washington political society and Newport's summer aristocracy. Janet and Hugh went on to have two children of their own together. Their first, a daughter named Janet Jennings Auchincloss, arrived on June 13th, 1945, and was known within the family simply as Janet Jr., or sometimes affectionately as Little Janet, to distinguish her from her mother. 2 years later, in 1947, Janet gave birth to a son, James Lee Auchincloss, who would be called Jaime for the rest of his life. With these two additions, Janet's family now included 4 children spanning 2 marriages, each of whom would go on to navigate remarkably different paths through adulthood, though none of them, at least in the public imagination, would ever come close to matching the fame that awaited Janet's eldest daughter. A fame that would eventually place Janet herself, however reluctantly, at the very center of one of the most closely documented family stories in modern American history. Yet the family's remarriage inevitably created its own quiet tensions as well, particularly around Jackie's relationship with her biological father. Though she continued adoring Blackjack and made real efforts to maintain their bond, the physical distance created by her mother's move to Virginia, combined with the emotional complications of watching her father struggle increasingly with loneliness and drink back in New York, meant that Jackie saw considerably less of him as the years went on, a painful undercurrent running beneath what otherwise appeared, from the outside, to be an enviably glamorous childhood, one that magazines and society columnists of the era frequently covered without ever fully acknowledging the more complicated emotional reality underneath. The father left behind, and a daughter's enduring loyalty. While Janet built her new life within the Auchincloss family's considerable wealth and social standing, Blackjack Bouvier's own circumstances grew increasingly difficult in the years following the divorce. He continued working on Wall Street, but his drinking, which had contributed so significantly to the collapse of his marriage, only worsened as he aged, and he spent an increasing amount of time drinking alone inside his New York City apartment on East 74th Street, growing more isolated from both his professional circles and, gradually, from his own daughters as well. A decline that longtime friends and colleagues reportedly found genuinely difficult to watch unfold, particularly given how charming and socially prominent he had once been during the earlier, more prosperous years of his marriage to Janet. Despite this painful distance, Jackie in particular never stopped loving her father, and she made considerable effort throughout her young adulthood to maintain whatever connection with him remained possible, writing to him regularly and visiting whenever her own increasingly busy schedule allowed. It was Blackjack, notably, who gave Jackie away at her wedding to a young congressman named John F. Kennedy in September of 1953. A moment of genuine pride for a man whose own life had grown so much smaller and more difficult by that point, and one that friends of the family described as one of the last truly joyful public moments of his life. Yet even that milestone carried its own quiet sadness, since Blackjack's failing health and ongoing struggles meant he was unable to attend the wedding reception that followed at Hammersmith Farm, the very estate that so vividly symbolized the more secure, prosperous life his ex-wife and daughters had built without him. A painful reminder of just how far his own circumstances had diverged from theirs over the preceding decade. By the mid-1950s, contact between Blackjack and his daughters had become increasingly sporadic, though never entirely severed. In 1957, he received a devastating diagnosis of terminal liver cancer, and he checked into Lenox Hill Hospital in New York for treatment. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he fell into a coma on August 1st, 1957, passing away just 2 days later on August 3rd at the age of 66. His funeral, arranged by Jackie and Lee together, took place at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, drawing a modest gathering of family and old friends who remembered the charming, once prominent man he had been before drink and isolation had so thoroughly reshaped the final years of his life. And he was laid to rest in the Bouvier family plot at Most Holy Trinity Catholic Cemetery in East Hampton, New York, not far from where his two daughters had spent so many happy childhood summers learning to ride horses under their mother's watchful eye decades earlier. A quiet and fitting final resting place for a man whose relationship with his daughters had always remained rooted, at least in part, in those early years spent together on Long Island. Blackjack's death closed out a painful chapter in Janet's own complicated family history, one defined by genuine heartbreak and eventual reinvention. But as Janet's own life continued forward through the following decades, her four children would each go on to write their own remarkably different stories, some touched by extraordinary fame and glamour, others marked by considerably more private struggle, and, in at least two devastating cases, by loss that would strike Janet with an almost unbearable sense of familiarity as the years went on. Jackie's extraordinary rise and a sister's own complicated path. Of Janet's four children, Jackie's path is, of course, the most widely known, carrying her from a debutante famously dubbed Debutante of the Year for the 1947 season, through her studies at Vassar College and later George Washington University, where she graduated in 1951 with a degree in French literature, and eventually into a brief career as a photographer and reporter for the Washington Times-Herald, a job her stepfather Hugh had personally helped arrange. She had also spent her junior year of college studying abroad in Paris, living with a French family, and further developing the deep affinity for French language and culture that would remain with her for the rest of her life, an interest she often connected back to memories of her father, whose own family history had traced back to France generations earlier. That connection to French culture would go on to define much of her public image during her years as First Lady, when her fluency and evident sophistication became a genuine diplomatic asset during official visits abroad. It was through her budding social and professional life in Washington that Jackie met a young Massachusetts congressman named John F. Kennedy in 1952, and the two married the following year, setting Jackie on a path that would eventually carry her into the White House itself as one of the most closely watched and admired First Ladies in American history. Jackie's younger sister Lee, meanwhile, charted her own considerably different course through adulthood, one that involved 3 marriages and a genuine lifelong immersion in international high society. Lee married publishing executive Michael Canfield in 1953, the same year Jackie married John Kennedy, and the couple relocated to London following their wedding, though that marriage ultimately ended in divorce by 1958, a first attempt at marriage that gave Lee her earliest taste of life within elite British society, one she would return to and expand upon considerably during her subsequent marriage. She married again in March of 1959, this time to Prince Stanisław Albrecht Radziwiłł, a Polish aristocrat, taking on the title of princess and settling into London society for many years, where the couple had 2 children together, a son named Anthony, born in 1959, and a daughter named Christina. Following her divorce from Radziwiłł, Lee married a third time to film and theatre director Herbert Ross in 1988, a marriage that lasted until his death in 2001, a union that brought her once again into close proximity with the world of entertainment and the arts that had fascinated her for much of her adult life. Given Ross's own considerable reputation as a director of both stage productions and Hollywood films, Lee spent much of her adult life dividing her time between London, New York, and eventually Paris, cultivating a reputation as one of the most fashionable and internationally connected women of her generation, closely associated with figures across the worlds of fashion, art, and design throughout the 1960s, 70s, and beyond. At one point working as a design consultant, and later exploring interests in interior design, acting, and writing across different chapters of her long and varied career, including a memoir and various magazine and television projects that allowed her to build a public identity distinct from, though inevitably compared to, her older sister's own extraordinary fame. Her relationship with her more famous older sister remained close throughout most of their lives, though it was, by most accounts, not without its own complexities, given the inevitable comparisons the two women faced throughout their entire adult lives, one sister forever cast in the shadow of the other's extraordinary and unprecedented level of global fame. A dynamic that biographers who studied the two sisters over the years have suggested created its own quiet, complicated tension beneath their evident closeness. Lee Radziwill passed away on February 15, 2019, in New York City, at the age of 85, having outlived her more famous sister by nearly a quarter century. Her death marked the end of a life that, while never approaching Jackie's own level of global recognition, had nonetheless carried Lee through her own remarkable journey across European aristocracy, international high society, and decades spent at the very center of the fashionable, glamorous world her mother had always believed her daughters were destined to inhabit. But even as Jackie and Lee built these very public, very well-documented lives, their two younger half-siblings from Janet's second marriage were growing up largely outside the spotlight, their own stories destined to remain far less familiar to the public, even though one of them would eventually be struck by a loss every bit as devastating as anything the more famous side of the family would ever endure. Janet Jr.'s life, and a loss that struck far too soon. Janet Jennings, Auchincloss, known within the family as Janet Jr. to distinguish her from her mother, grew up largely following the same elite educational path that had shaped her older half-sisters, attending the Potomac School in McLean, Virginia, followed by Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, the very same boarding school both Jackie and Lee had attended before her, and making her own society debut in 1963. She went on to study music history at Sarah Lawrence College, though she ultimately left before completing her degree in order to marry, a decision that reflected the same relatively early path toward marriage that many young women of her particular social background followed during that era. On July 30th, 1966, Janet Jr. married Louis Polk Rutherford, a recent Princeton graduate who would go on to build a career as an international financier, and whose own family carried its own considerable social pedigree, tracing back to a former governor of New York and vice president of the United States on his mother's side of the family, a lineage that placed the Rutherford family firmly within the same circles of established American wealth and influence that had shaped so much of Janet Jr.'s own upbringing. Their wedding took place at St. Mary's Church in Newport, the very same church where Jackie had married John F. Kennedy some 13 years earlier, and the ceremony reportedly drew a crowd of as many as 5,000 onlookers, a testament to just how much public fascination continued to surround the extended Bouvier and Auchincloss family even years after Jackie had left the White House. Following the wedding, the couple relocated to Hong Kong, where Janet Jr. went on to found an overseas chapter of the League of Women Voters, channeling her own energy into civic engagement work within their new international community. A choice that reflected a genuine interest in public service, distinct from the more purely social pursuits that had defined much of her own upbringing, and one that gave her a meaningful sense of purpose during the years the couple spent living abroad, far removed from the constant social scrutiny that continued to follow her more famous half-sisters back in the United States. The couple went on to have 3 children together during their years abroad, and, eventually, back in the United States, raising their family across two very different continents before eventually settling closer to home in their later years together. Tragically, Janet Jr.'s life was cut short by cancer. She died on March 13th, 1985, in a Boston hospital, at just 39 years old, with her older half-sister Jackie by her side during her final days, a detail that speaks to just how close the bond between the two half-sisters had remained, despite the considerable age gap and the very different levels of public attention each of them had experienced throughout their lives. A private memorial service was held afterward at Trinity Church in Newport, drawing family members together to mourn a woman whose own life, though considerably less publicly documented than her more famous half-sisters, had nonetheless been marked by real accomplishment and genuine warmth within her own circles, remembered by those who knew her as someone who had built a meaningful life of her own, both abroad and after her eventual return to the United States. For Janet Lee Bouvier, watching her second daughter die of cancer at such a young age represented an almost unbearable echo of loss, layered onto a life that had already seen its fair share of genuine hardship, from her own painful first divorce decades earlier to the more recent death of her second husband, Hugh Auchincloss, who had passed away in 1976, nearly a decade before his own daughter's untimely death. It was a loss that placed Janet in the deeply painful position of having now outlived one of her own 4 children, a burden she would carry for the remainder of her own life, even as her 4th child, her youngest son, Jaime, continued building a life of his own, well outside the public eye that had so thoroughly consumed his 2 eldest half-sisters. Jaime, the quiet youngest child. James Lee Auchincloss, known to nearly everyone simply as Jaime, was the youngest of Janet's 4 children, born in 1947 as the second child from her marriage to Hugh Auchincloss. Growing up as the baby of an unusually large blended family, Jaime occupied a somewhat unique position among his siblings, considerably younger than both of his famous half-sisters, and close enough in age to his sister Janet Jr. that the two shared much of their childhood together at Merrywood and Hammersmith Farm, growing up alongside one another through much of their formative years, even as their older half-sisters were already beginning to build lives and reputations of their own out in the wider world. Unlike Jackie's globally documented public life, or even Lee's considerably more internationally visible existence within European high society, Jaime has generally maintained a far quieter and more private adult life, one that has rarely attracted significant public or media attention over the decades. What is known suggests a life lived largely outside the glare that so thoroughly followed his 2 more famous half-sisters. A choice that, whether deliberate or simply a natural byproduct of his more private personality and interests, allowed him considerably more freedom from the kind of relentless public scrutiny that shaped so much of both Jackie's and, to a lesser extent, Lee's adult lives. A freedom that his sister Janet Jr. had also seemed to value during her own years spent largely abroad in Hong Kong, well removed from the constant American media attention that continued to follow her more famous half-sisters. Those who have crossed paths with Jaime over the years have generally described him as thoughtful and unassuming, someone who seemed genuinely content to let his more famous relatives occupy the public stage, while he built a quieter, more private existence for himself and his own family. As the family's youngest surviving child from either of Janet's 2 marriages, Jaime occupies a distinctive position within the broader Bouvier and Auchincloss family history. One final living connection to a childhood that included some of the most consequential events of an entire generation, from his eldest half-sister's rise to become one of the most recognized women in the entire world, to the profound losses that would eventually touch nearly every corner of his extended family, including the deaths of his father in 1976, his sister Janet Jr. in 1985, his mother in 1989, and eventually both of his more famous half-sisters Jackie in 1994, and Lee in 2019. Losses that unfolded across nearly half a century. And that left Jaime as one of the few remaining people who had personally witnessed the entire arc of his family's remarkable and often difficult story from beginning to end. Occasionally, over the years, Jaime has surfaced in family retrospectives or documentary projects examining his more famous relatives, offering brief but genuine glimpses into the private family dynamics that so rarely made their way into the public record during the decades his sisters spent living so thoroughly under public observation. As Janet herself moved into her final decades, it would ultimately be her own health, rather than any external tragedy, that would define the closing chapter of her long and eventful life. Janet's final years, and a third marriage late in life. Following Hugh Auchincloss's death in 1976, Janet found herself widowed for the second time in her life, having already survived the collapse of her first marriage to Blackjack Bouvier decades earlier. Rather than remaining alone, Janet, at 72 years old, married a third time on October 25, 1979, to Bingham Willing Morris, known affectionately as Booch, an investment broker and childhood friend she had known for many years before their eventual marriage. A familiar, comfortable connection that reportedly gave her real companionship during a period of her life when so many of her closest friends and family members from earlier decades had already passed on or moved considerably further away. Notably, Jackie herself served as a witness at her mother's third wedding, a small but meaningful gesture from a daughter who had, by that point, already lived through her own second marriage to Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, and had since been widowed once again following Onassis's death in 1975, meaning both mother and daughter found themselves navigating widowhood and remarriage during roughly the same stretch of years, a quiet parallel between their two otherwise very different lives. Janet and Bingham's marriage, however, did not prove particularly lasting in practice, even though the two never formally divorced. The couple separated in 1981, just 2 years after their wedding, though they remained legally married for the rest of Janet's life. A somewhat unusual arrangement that nonetheless reflected the complicated, often unconventional nature of relationships within Janet's extended social world throughout her later decades. One where formal marital status and actual day-to-day living arrangements did not always align neatly with one another. In her final years, Janet's health began to decline significantly as she developed Alzheimer's disease, a condition that gradually eroded her memory and cognitive function over an extended period, requiring increasing levels of care and support from those closest to her as the disease progressed. A decline that those who had known her during her more vibrant, socially active decades found particularly painful to witness, given how sharp and socially engaged she had remained well into her 70s. She spent her remaining years largely at Hammersmith Farm and in Newport, Rhode Island, the very community where she had built so much of her later social life following her second marriage decades earlier, remaining connected to civic and cultural institutions in the area, including serving on the boards of both the Newport Historical Society and the Redwood Library, organizations that reflected her lifelong interest in art, culture, and local history, even as her own health continued to decline. Janet Lee Bouvier Auchincloss Morris died on July 22, 1989, in Newport, Rhode Island, at the age of 81, from complications arising from her Alzheimer's disease. In a small, quietly poignant detail, her death fell on the very same date as the birthday of Rose Kennedy, her daughter Jackie's own mother-in-law through her marriage to John F. Kennedy decades earlier, a small coincidence linking two of the most consequential maternal figures connected to one of America's most famous political families. Services for Janet were held shortly afterward, drawing together the surviving members of her large, complicated, blended family to say their final goodbyes to a woman whose own life had encompassed 3 marriages, 4 children, and decades spent at the very center of American high society, a life that had carried her from a comfortable but relatively ordinary Manhattan childhood all the way to a permanent, if largely unacknowledged, place in one of the defining American family stories of the entire 20th century. A mother's complicated legacy, carried forward by her children. Looking back across the full sweep of Janet Lee Bouvier's own life, what emerges is a story considerably more layered than the brief mentions she typically receives as simply the mother of America's most famous First Lady. She was a woman shaped by genuine ambition and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what social and financial security could provide. Lessons she passed down deliberately to her 2 eldest daughters over countless childhood tea times. Lessons that would go on to shape both Jackie's and Lee's own approaches to marriage, security, and social standing throughout their respective adult lives. Approaches that would carry both daughters through multiple marriages of their own, each one entered into with a keen awareness of the practical realities their mother had so plainly spelled out for them decades earlier. She survived the public collapse of her first marriage, successfully rebuilt an even more prosperous and prominent life through her second, and eventually outlived one of her own 4 children, absorbing a loss that few parents, regardless of their wealth or social standing, could ever fully prepare themselves for. Her own life also traced, in miniature, many of the broader social currents that shaped American high society across much of the 20th century, from the glamorous excess and eventual scandal of the pre-war years, through the post-war rebuilding of fortunes and reputations, and finally into the more fragmented, media-saturated decades that would eventually transform her own daughter into arguably the single most photographed and most closely watched woman the world had ever seen. Janet herself never sought that level of fame for her own sake, remaining, by most accounts, considerably more private and reserved than either of her 2 most famous children. Yet her influence on both of their lives, and by extension on the broader story of American celebrity and political culture throughout the 20th century, remains difficult to overstate. A quiet but foundational presence behind 2 of the most recognizable names of her era. Her 4 children, in turn, each carried forward distinctly different pieces of the complicated inheritance Janet had passed down to them. Jackie became perhaps the most recognized and admired woman of her entire generation, carrying her mother's lessons about grace, composure, and quiet strength through some of the most publicly devastating moments any First Lady has ever had to endure. Moments that included not only the assassination of her first husband, but also the earlier losses of 2 of her own children during infancy. Lee built her own glamorous, internationally connected life across 3 marriages and multiple continents, forever existing in close proximity to, yet distinctly separate from, her older sister's unprecedented fame, carving out her own considerable reputation within European high society, even as comparisons to Jackie inevitably followed her throughout her entire adult life. Janet Jr. found genuine purpose and civic engagement during her own too short life abroad before cancer claimed her at just 39, a loss her mother carried for the remainder of her own days, one that stood as a stark reminder that even families of extraordinary wealth and privilege remain entirely vulnerable to the same devastating losses that touch ordinary families everywhere. And Jaime, the family's quietest and least publicly documented child, chose a life lived largely outside the intense scrutiny that had defined so much of his siblings' existence, a choice that, in its own understated way, may have represented the most genuinely peaceful path of all 4 Bouvier and Auchincloss children. What remains today is the fuller, more complete story of a woman whose own name rarely appears in the history books, yet whose influence, for better and for worse, touched nearly every significant chapter of one of America's most closely watched families, from a Southampton delivery room in 1929 all the way through decades of triumph, heartbreak, and eventual quiet loss that carried her family's story from the glamour of post-war American society all the way to the closing years of the 20th century. Janet Lee Bouvier's own story, so often reduced to a single line in her daughter's far more famous biography, deserves to be remembered as something considerably richer. The story of an ambitious, resilient woman who survived heartbreak, rebuilt her life more than once, and ultimately watched her children carry her own complicated legacy of grace, glamour, and quiet endurance forward into an entirely new generation. It is a story that reminds us, in the end, that even the most carefully composed public images, the kind Jackie herself became so famous for projecting to the entire world, are almost always built upon a far more complicated and deeply human private history, one that a mother named Janet quietly carried and quietly shaped for the better part of an entire century, long before the world ever learned to say her name in the same breath as her daughters. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.